Hello, my name's John Paul and I work with Mark and David. Mark is in the room with you. I'm sorry I can't be with you. This presentation is about video-based pedagogy analysis, combining teacher, pupil and researcher perspectives. In trying to decide between alternative strategies, we're often faced with a comparison of apples and oranges because the choices do not address the same factors. Only with a mutual understanding of what comprises military strategy can we hope to improve our strategic dialogue. Now, the focus of this talk is on pedagogical strategy, not military strategy, but I think this idea of improving our strategic dialogue is something that I'm really interested in, and I hope to show you how I'd like to contribute to that in this work. Now, this is the plan for what we're going to do, and I'll launch straight into that. Afterwards, I'll be joining you over Skype. So if you have questions and comments, I'd be really interested in your thoughts about this. So this is video-based research which uses grounded theory to understand and explain the pedagogy enacted during 3 science lessons on the subject of chromatography, involving an experienced science teacher, that's David, one of the researchers as well, and a class of 13 to 14-year-old pupils. So I think this work matters because the pedagogy analysis framework which emerged from previous work and which was further refined in this study, allows subtle and complicated interactions between participants in the data to be understood and explained. So this study finished in July 2018 and took place in one secondary school in Kent in the UK. Pedagogy is a contested term. Here it involves elements influencing teaching and learning and the interrelationships between these elements. Similarly, instructional strategy has been researched for a long time, but no consensus exists as to what strategy means. Strategy in this study is understood as the way means are used to try and achieve ends. In this study, strategy is understood to involve the intended, enacted, and evaluated curricula. The following pedagogy analysis framework was a finding of previous work and is a type of problem-solving heuristic called a means-ends analysis. Pedagogy analysis involves problem-solving by researchers about the problem-solving participants do before, during, and after lessons. Many pedagogical problems faced by participants in the previous study are ill-structured, meaning they are without clear solution paths, as opposed to well-structured problems which have clear steps to the solution. Pedagogical problem solving here is cyclical. The solution of one problem becomes part of the input to another. So here is the pedagogy analysis framework. Pedagogical strategy, like military strategy, can be understood as a bridge between the means, both human and non-human resources, a participant has at their disposal, and the ends, which can be personal, political, and/or logistical objectives they seek. Each participant's means, strategy, and ends are continuously adjusted and/or abandoned as the attributes of means change. So an example of an attribute is the information available to a participant at a particular time. The strategic spectrum varies from the microscale, an action, through the mesoscale, a sequence of actions, otherwise known as a tactic, to a macro scale, how each participant uses their localized understanding to try and achieve systemic change, otherwise known as grand strategy. Ends can be personal, i.e. cognitive, affective, conative, or social, political, i.e. internal or external to the classroom, or logistical. Accidents are when things go wrong. This graphic illustrates the pedagogy analysis framework. You can see the means, and those means have particular attributes. You can see strategy, both the micro, meso and macro scales. And I've given examples of a micro scale action, say for example a pupil putting up their hand, a mesoscale strategy, for example a pupil says something and then the teacher repeats what they've said. And then what's difficult to illustrate here is the macro scale grand strategy. That's something that involves the means, strategy, ends and accidents. One way to understand it is if you need a thick description to explain what's going on in these sorts of data, that's a macro strategy. I've also illustrated ends there, both personal, political and logistical, and accidents. Teachers need effective pedagogical strategies, for example, conceptual change strategies. Dewitt et al. 2008 identified a gap between research about conceptual change pedagogy and practice. Current methodologies for exploring conceptual change pedagogy do not always investigate teachers' complicated thinking processes while they attempt to promote conceptual change. This is problematic. Researchers may be missing data from teachers and pupils that could help them understand pedagogy better. The pedagogy analysis framework, which was a finding of a previous study, had several limitations. This present study addresses some of those limitations. For example, this present study explores the naturalistic context of 3 real science lessons and introduces pupil verbal protocols to the research design. So the research questions are: how can the tactics used by participants in 3 consecutive science lessons with a class of 13-year-old pupils be understood and explained? And what are the benefits and limitations of combining video-based lesson analyses by multiple participants, where the participants are the teacher, researchers and pupils? To give an overview of the research design, the methods used are lesson video analysis, teacher verbal protocols, pupil group verbal protocols and researcher group interviews, and I'll give more details in a moment about all of that. The methodology is Straussian grounded theory, which has a particular interpretivist theoretical perspective that underpins it, that of symbolic interactionism, and the epistemology that underpins all of this work is social constructionism. The quote there from Clark is, "With deep roots in symbolic interactionist sociology and pragmatist philosophy, the grounded theory method can be viewed as a theory methods package with an interpretive constructionist epistemology." The research methods used are lesson video analysis, so 3 lessons of 1 hour each on the topic of chromatography. Then the teacher watches the videos back and thinks aloud, so produces verbal protocols. Those verbal protocols are recorded on a second video. Then a group of pupils, 3 girls and 3 boys from the class, watch clips of the lesson back. We use clips for practical reasons, and think aloud, and we record that on a third video. And then finally the 2 researchers and the teacher, so 3 researchers together, video ourselves in a retrospective conversation about the coding. The methodology is Straussian grounded theory, so this is a systematic set of procedures to develop an inductively derived grounded theory about a phenomenon. I won't read out all those procedures, and because we're short on time, I'm not planning on going through the procedures now with you. I'm going to assume that people are okay with grounded theory, or will question me at the end if you'd like me to go over any of those procedures. Now, participants in this study were a convenience sample. So 1 secondary science teacher, a physics specialist, and one class of 13 to 14-year-old pupils from Year 9 in UK participated. The teacher was recruited from among 211 secondary school science advanced skills teachers in the UK. The 3 pupil group verbal protocol interviews were with 6 volunteers from the class, 3 girls and 3 boys. And the sample size needed to be balanced against the depth of analysis. So as the theoretical perspective is interpretive, a small sample was used so that data could be examined in considerable detail. Approximately 15 hours of video were analysed. So as regards ethics, the BERA guidelines were followed. We're not using any images of pupils in publications. We only refer to pupils by their initials. Informed consent and assent was sought from the teacher, formal permission from the head teacher as a gatekeeper, and data was held securely. So moving on to findings, the pedagogical tactics identified in these data include inform, including misinform and disinform, question, many types of questioning coming out, instruct, use space and or time, for example, move an object, repeat, train, for example, to train somebody in a skill, assess, both summative and formative assessment, and interact, both oppose and cooperate. This graphic gives some more information about the tactics. There isn't time in a short talk like this to give much detail, but I'm going to just talk through one more of these. Say, question here, where the teacher asks a question, the pupil indicates by putting a hand up that they'd like to answer, the teacher indicates that they're the person to answer, then the pupil gives some information, and then as a result of that, the teacher then has some information. There's lots of different types of question. This is the final coding grid. Coding grid changes a lot when you're doing grounded theory. I call this the pedagogy profile. On the x-axis, you can see the pedagogy analysis framework element. And then on the y-axis, you can see the number of times that element was coded. So it gives you an idea of just how often some of these elements of the framework occurred. This gives a rough idea. These are coding stripes from NVivo software. Just gives you a rough idea of just how rich these data are. That lots of elements of the pedagogy analysis framework were used simultaneously. So as regards originality, firstly, a video-based grounded theory study of classroom pedagogy from an interpretivist theoretical perspective and using a constructionist epistemology would appear from my investigations to be unique. Secondly, combining verbal protocols and retrospective debriefing is uncommon in the research literature. Therefore, combining verbal protocols and researcher group interviews with lesson video analysis by the teacher, a group of pupils and researchers, constitutes an original approach. Finally, the Clausewitzian understanding of pedagogical strategy does not support the idea of strategy being merely a plan for a teacher to implement. The strategy as plan view is prevalent in educational literature and among teachers. So debate continues about rigour in qualitative research like this. Now, the validity of evidence ought to be considered by the criteria of the theoretical perspective that underpins the research. And we argue that the techniques of Lincoln and Goober 1985 to ensure credibility, transferability, dependability and confirmability used alongside grounded theory methods can give trustworthy evidence. Video evidence with a complete auditable record on NVivo provides transparency in the research process. I argue that this work is significant because the framework for interpreting pedagogical strategy which has emerged could help strategic dialogue between teachers and researchers, could help experienced practitioners understand their own practice better, and could be useful for video-supported reflection, particularly in ITE work, initial teacher education work. So this slide highlights some of the advantages and disadvantages of using multiple perspectives as we have in this research. So on the for side, participants construct knowledge together. This work rejects the individualistic, isolated knower from constructivism. The work acknowledges unique perspectives and insights of different participants. And this sort of approach increases credibility. For example, researcher triangulation and peer debriefing are both possible. But of course, there's a downside to this sort of approach. There is some convergence in interpretation, but lots of divergence. Grounded theory analysis is already painstaking at the best of times, and this research design makes this even more challenging. And there are a lot of logistical difficulties in doing this sort of research. So, for example, the sound quality and lack of access to NVivo for Teams in this project were particular difficulties. The finding of this work is a refinement of the pedagogy analysis framework, which is a substantive grounded theory, not a formal grounded theory, addressing limitations in previous work, which may help teachers and researchers understand and explain tactics used by participants in school lessons. The research design accesses some of the complicated thinking processes of the teacher and of some of the pupils, while they explain how they understand incidents in these data. Research designs for exploring pedagogy which take into account the perspectives of teacher, pupils and researchers may help address the gap between conceptual change research and instructional practice identified in the literature. This work clearly has many limitations. So, for example, the small sample size limits the potential to generalize. A forensic focus on the lesson means this sort of study needs to be accompanied by other research designs. For example, an ethnographic study of the school to help understand the context better. Changes in the pedagogy analysis framework mean data need to be recoded. Combining analyses from multiple participants may work better with a modified research design. And I'm sure there are other limitations. This slide gives some information about the next steps that we're planning. So I don't have time in a presentation like this to share with you, these data, which is a terrible shame, but here's one quote. This is a pupil aged 13 to 14 in one of the pupil verbal protocol interviews. She said, "I think we always knew these lessons were all effective, but we never knew why. So these sort of sessions have been interesting to sort of see the little things that made it impactful." Brief bibliography, please email me if you'd like a full bibliography or the paper. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, we'd be delighted to hear those now. Bye-bye.